going, but so first thing I was going to say is we will be recording this, and we will share the link to the recording shortly with everyone. And so welcome you to share it out. So good morning, everyone. I'm Peter Enrich. I'm part of the Progressive Dems leadership team, and I'm going to be facilitating today's conversation. This is PDM is doing a series of forums trying to get our arms around the challenges of the housing crisis, and moving toward ways that activists like our members can get involved in trying to address the challenges that are facing us in this area. And we have already done 2 forums, which are available, links to them are available on our website. The first one was a general introduction and overview of the housing crisis, and identified the core problem, which is that we aren't providing enough housing units for the demand in the state, and that's driving up costs and limiting access. And we talked a lot about the actual challenges that poses in families' lives. And the next 3 forums, of which this is the middle one, are attempts to dig into what we're seeing as 3 key aspects of the crisis. The first one that we did, the second forum, was essentially about safety net issues. What do we do while we still have this deep mismatch between housing supply and housing demand? How do we protect people in their current housing? How do we protect people who have lost housing in the near term? And addressed a range of topics around that. Today's forum and the next one that we're going to do in about a month are trying to address, why do we have the shortfall of several 100,000 units, and what's it going to take to correct that shortfall over the longer term? And we're dividing that up into 2 pieces. The piece that we're going to be addressing today are regulatory issues, issues about zoning, about permitting, ways that those are posing obstacles to building the kind of housing we need, how they can be turned into constructive incentives to doing the kind of housing we need. And then the next forum in about a month is going to be about the economic aspects of this. You can't build housing at a cost that provides that lets the housing be affordable to the people who need it. So how do you close that gap? What kind of governmental financial supports, tax credits, subsidies, vouchers are the ways to address that gap? And then in beginning of the new year, we're going to do a final forum in which we're going to try and look over the whole problem and identify what are the key dimensions that particularly progressive advocates like our members should be working on to try and achieve real change and to address this huge challenge. So hope that you'll pay attention. If you haven't seen the first 2, I think they're both very interesting and constructive. And I hope you'll also stick with us for the next 2 and help us then move on to actually moving this problem forward. Couple of logistical things before we begin. We've got a very full agenda for today, and so we probably will not have an opportunity to take questions from all of you. If you do have things that you want clarification of, feel free to pose a question in the chat and we will try and address that. We found that it's not helpful for people to sort of try and engage in a debate and raise separate concerns and issues in the chat. it distracts people from the main thread of conversation. So we encourage you to limit use of chat to questions that you really think we need to answer to move things forward. As you saw, we are recording the session, so I hope people are comfortable with that. And so without further ado, let me introduce, as those of us in PDM's housing working group have started to dig into this, we have just been so amazed by the wonderful organizations and the wonderful people who are digging into this problem and have been at it for years and years. And it's a privilege to have three of those folks with us today as our panelists. And so let me just quickly introduce them each, and then we'll get down to it. So first, I'm delighted that we have Mayor Jared Nicholson, the mayor of Lynn, a city that has been doing a lot of very exciting stuff in the housing area. Mayor Nicholson was elected 2 years ago, serving his first term, where he's been focusing on schools, housing, jobs, and all the things that really make a gateway city a more livable place. Before he was elected, he served several terms on the Lynn School Committee. I first knew him as a fellow law professor at Northeastern University, where he led the Community Economic Development Clinic for several years. And again, we're thrilled to have him here. Second, we've got Eric Shupin, who for many years was the Director of Public Policy at CHAPA, the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, which has been one of the leading organizations on housing issues for as long as I can remember. And Eric played a critical role there for many years. And he has now stepped in as Chief of Policy at the brand new Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, and has been one of the key architects of the recently submitted governor's housing bond bill and affordable housing plan. And then third, we have Kassie Infante, who is an associate director at Abundant Housing Massachusetts, which is another one of the really important organizations that's provided coalition building and leadership for pro-housing advocates across the state. She is also, I hadn't known this, but an appointed member of the Zoning Board of Appeals in Haverhill, so brings that perspective as well. We had originally hoped to have Representative Andy Vargas, who is sponsoring an important piece of legislation. He had a conflict at the last minute. Kassie is quite familiar with his legislation, and hopefully he'll be able to talk some about that in his absence, but we're sorry to miss him. So with all that said, let's dig into today's issue, which is the role of zoning and permitting regulation at the local level on the housing supply. And I think the starting place is really to talk about the problems that zoning and permitting have posed for providing adequate housing supply for many years. I hope many of you saw the Globe had a really interesting, fairly deep exploration of one town, Milton, and the way that zoning and regulation there have been an obstacle to a more inclusive housing mix there. But that's pretty typical of what we've seen in many of our suburban communities for many years. And so Kassie, I don't know, could you talk a little bit about where some of those problems come from?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I hope everyone is taking care. It's great to see a few familiar faces here from PDM. And I'd like to just sort of start off by talking a little bit about the history of how we got here. I think that's really important, and I think it really affects the hearts and minds and our attitudes around housing and who is deserving of housing. It's really important to remember that our sort of laws and mindsets around land use are truly rooted in a history of exclusion, particularly racism against African Americans, working class folks, and also classism. And that was really all by design. I'm sure many of you might be familiar with Richard Rothstein's landmark work around the color of law and really taking a deeper dive into the effects of redlining in particular. What's important to remember about that is that redlining really cemented and locked in the segregation that we're seeing today. And that segregation is directly correlated to zoning, to a third of our state being almost exclusively zoned for single family homes only. And that ultimately decided, which areas, which of our communities are worthy of investment and which aren't. And that's not to mention, of course, more aspects of this, which include discriminatory lending aspects, racial covenants and deeds, which actually are still, which still exist in deeds. In fact, there was a recent study that showed even where I live in Haverhill, about 30 racial covenants were found in deeds, about 559 across the state. And while those might not be legally enforceable today, it's important to note that there's a correlation, right? And that areas that are formerly redlined are mostly zoned for single family homes. And when you're only zoning for single family homes, it makes it really difficult for lower income people to access housing. And so this history also reinforces our local politics around attitudes and beliefs and entitlements. So for myself as a zoning board of appeals member, I often am sitting in meetings that are not always representative of the community at large. And that's really difficult because in Massachusetts, we are a very parochial state. We really value local control. And so you have just over 350 communities making independent decisions about land use and development, often not looking at housing as a regional issue. And oftentimes, who shows up to local meetings are often saying no to new housing. They don't want change. They don't want more housing. They don't want to welcome more people into their neighborhood. And I've seen that firsthand in my community. The other piece I want to mention, and I'll turn things back over to Peter because I know we'll have more time to dig into these specific issues, is that oftentimes the permitting process to even build a new home, for example, if someone wants to build an accessory dwelling unit on their property, can actually be quite confusing, expensive, and by design, exclusive to those who are already privileged to be able to afford, for example, a land use attorney, or those who are already embedded into the system and understand it. I've seen firsthand, oftentimes in my community of Haverhill, Latino families will come to a meeting. They want to build an accessory dwelling unit. They don't understand why it's so difficult. And so when we talk about changing zoning, we need to be able to allow more multifamily homes, as well as other missing middle housing. And when we make things by right, that can really help counter the expensive, confusing permitting process. Not completely counter it, of course, we'll still go through those things, but it will certainly make it more equitable. So that's what I'll say. I hope, Peter, that framed and answered your question. I'm happy to dig into more issues as we go.
Great, thank you. I think that's really helpful, and it does set the stage. We have a history of zoning and permitting processes that make it very hard in many communities around the state to build the kinds of housing that we need if we're going to meet the needs. So the question is, what can be done about that in terms of local zoning and permitting. And I think maybe the place we should start is by recognizing that this has been a well understood issue for a number of years, and there have been a number of steps already taken to try and address that. And Eric, could I ask you to talk a little bit about what some of those are? And then I want to turn specifically to some of the things that Mayor Nicholson has been able to do in Lynn as examples of what we can do, and then turn to the question of what more do we need, what is in pending legislation. But Eric, if you can start us off with a little bit about things that are already happening and in place.
Sure, and thank you for having me. And we're excited to participate in this conversation. I'm excited to participate, but also our office. I mean, there's a lot of really exciting things going on already when it comes to increasing our capacity to build new homes at the local level. First and foremost, it's working with our communities at the local level and community members, and helping support them in their work to put in place plans, housing production plans, and then implement those plans, technical assistance, help with zoning matters, and again, supporting local communities, because ultimately that's where these decisions are made. And in addition to that, the state has recently put in place new policies that will open up a lot more zoning, hopefully, capacity in the eastern part of the state. We have our MBTA communities law that was passed a few years ago, and we're beginning to see the impacts. I see Catherine from Equitable Arlington. Amazing work this week, just getting that through town meeting. I mean, that's huge. And I know others are working in Brookline and in other places to move this forward. But that is changing the conversation at the local level, and you're seeing the results. I mean, the amount, the margin that Arlington, that your bylaw passed by is incredible. It wasn't even close. Now, was it easy? Absolutely not. But the state has that, the new law, the MBTA communities law, which we're saying, you have to zone for a certain amount of housing around public transportation. And if you don't, you lose access to a lot of different pools of state funds. And it's a requirement. So we really do see it as something that cities and towns need to do. Currently, 176 of the 177 are in compliance. And our office wants to continue to work with communities to make sure that we get to 177 communities and that they pass really strong, great bylaws to open up that capacity. But those are conversations that are just happening within the past few years. And so it's really a game changer when it comes to getting communities to do more when it comes to housing.
Do you want to say a few words also, Eric, about 40R?
Sure. There are other tools that we do have in place, and they've been around for a little while. One of them, as Peter said, is a law called Chapter 40R. And 40R is our smart growth zoning law, we like to call it. And it allows communities to pass a 40R district, a district where multifamily affordable housing in smart growth locations are allowed by right. And in return for that, return for doing that kind of zoning, the community will get an incentive payment. And then in return for housing actually being built in those zones, so putting the zoning in place is one step, getting housing built is another. Once that housing is built, there's another incentive payment. In addition to that, there's also an incentive payment for any increased school costs that are tied to that multifamily housing. There's an incentive payment that communities can access for that as well. So again, and we see it as a partnership of, here are good zoning things that you can put into place, and we want to help you get there by providing these incentive payments. The other resource that I'd be remiss not to add from those tools at the state level is Chapter 40B, which overrides local zoning if a community doesn't have a certain amount of affordable housing. And this has been around for more than 50 years and is not without its controversy. But it's the kind of tool that often, unfortunately, is sometimes needed to break through those local barriers. If you know, if a community isn't meeting their part to contribute to our affordable housing in the state.
Thank you, Art. Yeah, those are both really important pieces of the puzzle, although they each have their challenges that if we had infinite time, we could really dig into a little bit. But Jared, I want to turn to you, and can you talk a little bit about, you've only been in office for 2 years. You've gotten a lot done on the housing front, and Lynn, talk to us about what you've been able to accomplish.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's great to be back in dialogue in this kind of setting again from a time in Northeastern, and thank you for PDM for hosting us, and it's an honor to be here with my fellow panelists. Thanks everybody for tuning in on this beautiful Friday. So the issues that Kassie explained are certainly present and real for us. And, you know, we really appreciate the work that Eric's been describing that's happening at the state level, and are excited about the conversation about transit-oriented development and the potential for growth, because it's exactly what we've been pursuing here in Lynn. And, you know, I really see it as an opportunity for us because we have the need. We have folks that are struggling with the cost of housing. And we also have a lot of potential, and there's a way that we can meet this need that benefits everybody, that taps into that potential and really helps us solve the other problems that we have by growing in a positive and inclusive way. So that's been our headline goal, to try to find and identify that inclusive growth. And the permitting process has been a part of that in terms of what we've been able to do. One of the first things that I did when I got into office was work with the council to try to streamline the development process. It was previously, you know, disjointed, slow, and some oftentimes would feel arbitrary, and we didn't have a silver bullet to reform legally a lot of the issues, but we were able to try to drive towards a consensus with the council to commit to doing things together in a way that was going to streamline things. So we've been able to bring all the city departments and officials that have a say in the development process at one point or another together very early on, and try to give that kind of streamlined feedback to development proposals. And I think that's really resulted in a better review of projects that help the city, from the city's perspective, to get that feedback all at once. Allows the review to be, you know, the whole to be greater than the sum of its parts, rather than bouncing from department to department. So you get better review, and from the city's perspective, and then from the developer's perspective, they get answers more quickly. And the feedback we've gotten from developers has been really positive. That it makes them want to do business here. So we've been excited about that, and are going to try to continue that momentum. We have also taken a step to try to ensure that the growth is benefiting everyone by passing inclusionary zoning in the city. We did that last year. We didn't have it previously, and we try to run a process to be really thoughtful about how to make sure to create more opportunities for affordable housing without disrupting the potential for growth, and trying to calibrate that by getting an economics consulting firm on board to do a market analysis, so that we were getting our own data about what the market could bear in terms of affordability, and not just taking developers' word for it, because a lot of developers would say, well, if you do that, we won't be able to build, and wanting to get our own independent analysis of that dynamic. And we're able to get to an ordinance that requires 10% of units in new development to be affordable at 60% of the area median income. And it's really important for us that we didn't stop at the 80% area median income, because in a city like Lynn, in the Boston, greater Boston area median income, in the catchment area that we're in, 80% of area median income is really probably above our median income in the city of Lynn. So that was an important dynamic. And we also, I think, we're able to strike an interesting approach to the question a lot of inclusionary zoning ordinances have about when it should apply. A lot of ordinances say, well, it's 10 units above, or it's 8 units above, or it's 6 units above. And then by doing that, you get a rush from developers to do developments with one less unit than the threshold. So our approach to that was to say it applies to every development, regardless of unit size, except for single family homes. And if it's under 10, then you pay a fractional payment in lieu of creation of an affordable housing unit, so that everybody is helping us address this issue.
I want to come back in a few minutes and talk about what the political process of getting those things done in Lynn was, but those are excellent examples of the kind of work that we need to see throughout the state. Let's talk next briefly about what more is pending at the state level in terms of additional measures that can move the regulatory ball forward. And Kassie, can we start? Can you talk a little bit about Representative Vargas's so-called YIMBY bill and what it seeks to do? I mean, maybe you should start by defining YIMBY.
Sure, thank you, Peter. And so YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard. It is a sort of identifier and signifier that folks in a community are open to welcoming more people into their community as well and sharing space. It is sort of the opposite of what's called NIMBY, No in My Backyard. So there's also a term called bananas, meaning we won't build anything anywhere, anytime, which is basically the result of over 350 communities saying, yes, we need housing, but not here. So let's build it elsewhere. So there's so many acronyms in housing, which is a part of, in my opinion, sometimes the problem with inclusion and bringing more folks into advocacy. But back to the bill. So this legislative session, Abundant Housing filed an act to promote Yes in My Backyard that was with Representative Andy Vargas and Senator Brendan Creighton. And it's essentially a comprehensive zoning reform bill that's really designed to create housing abundance, bring more housing options such as missing middle housing, to transit-oriented communities throughout Massachusetts. And so I know we've been talking about the MBTA communities law. What this bill would do is effectively expand multifamily zoning across the state, so to other suitable locations that have public transportation options. It would also remove costly parking mandates. And so something that we've been doing some more education work around is building more awareness around how costly parking mandates actually drive the cost of housing up. That's not to say that every development doesn't need parking, it doesn't get rid of parking, but certainly prioritizing people and building more homes over parking and creating space for cars. Something else that this bill would do is establish a statewide housing production goal of 427,000 new units by 2040, 85,400 of which will be income restricted. That's really important because, you know, we really feel, and certainly Rep. Vargas and Senator Creighton understand that for so long in Massachusetts, we've had this understanding of the housing shortage, but we've never actually there have been efforts, but we can do better about quantifying and making sure that we're benchmarking and keeping track of actually how much housing we're building. This bill would also legalize accessory dwelling units as of right statewide, which we're really excited about, is included in the housing bond bill. This is really important to just add gentle density to communities, to give homeowners in particular the opportunity, for example, for their family member to age in place, for their college student to come back home and have a place to live, or just for them to have rental income and provide another housing option in their community. It would also create a streamlined process for turning vacant land and commercial properties into multifamily housing. So really taking advantage of the land that we do have that might be available and prioritizing the disposition of state-owned land for affordable housing. It also references inclusionary zoning and allowing communities to adopt that by simple majority. As we know, as Mayor Nicholson was just saying, that's a really important tool in particular to bring in more affordability. So we're really excited about this bill. Because of the legislative session we're in, it won't be acted on until next year, but we're in particular excited that the ADU and inclusionary zoning elements were included in the bond bill. So we're really excited for the chance of both those aspects being signed into law.
Great, thank you. And so, Eric, now I want to turn it to you, and I need to start by saying the governor's bond bill that was filed last week is an amazing piece of work, and I know you played a critical role in putting it together. I also know you could probably, I've heard you talk for a half an hour or more about what's in the bond bill, and we'll certainly return to many aspects of it in our next forum when we talk about the financial aspects. And we'll put in the chat a link. The governor's office has put out a really nice summary of the tremendous number of things that the bond bill proposes to do, and I encourage people to look at that and become familiar with it. And we're going to be coming back to it over and over again over the coming months. But Eric, if you could just focus in on the pieces of the bond bill that are directed at the local permitting process and that would move the ball in those areas, I think that'd be a great place to spend a couple of minutes.
Sure. So Peter, you're saying I shouldn't talk for a half an hour about the bond bill right now. I just
not today. I bet you could talk for 3 hours.
I could talk as long as you want. No, I appreciate those kind words, and I'm really excited about Governor Healey's Affordable Homes Act, the housing bond bill that she filed just last week, and really sets forth a bold vision, a bold statement that housing is a priority, but that we can also take this on. And so everything in this bond bill, the Affordable Homes Act, goes towards creating the number of homes that we need and creating the number of affordable homes that we need in Massachusetts. And so I'm really proud to have played a part in that. It does have a whole bunch of components, as Peter mentioned. It has capital authorizations for affordable housing and middle income housing programs, $4.12 billion, the largest investment in the state's history through this authorization. It has tax credits, and it has some really bold and big but achievable policy initiatives. And that's where these policy initiatives capture a lot of the great ideas that are out there. The governor certainly sees a good idea, or when she recognizes a good idea when she sees it, including some things from legislation like the YIMBY bill that Kassie was just describing, but really directed at legislation and also executive orders to reduce barriers to housing production and preservation, and also support local communities and provide them with tools to take on their housing challenges. So, I wanted to talk about a few of those right now. I think one that Kassie had already mentioned was ADUs. Seeing this as an opportunity to unlock, in zoning capacity, millions of units of zoning capacity in Massachusetts. So allowing an accessory dwelling unit to be built by right on any single family zone lot in Massachusetts. Now we know that we're not going to get, it's that many built right away. Kassie talked about some of the barriers, and this legislation actually works to address some of those barriers, but we anticipate tens of thousands of new homes over the next decade could be built if we allow ADUs by right. Some of the things that we included in this legislation, that the governor included in her legislation, would be limiting parking restrictions. So if you're within a half mile of public transportation, saying you don't need an additional parking spot. And also limiting owner occupancy restrictions. Those are a few things, as we've seen some other states do this. Those are the key barriers that come up as like, okay, you have by right ADUs, but there's not a lot being built. Why? And those are some of those key barriers that we've identified. Kassie talked about inclusionary zoning by a simple majority, adding that to the list of items as part of the housing choice legislation passed a few years ago that makes it easier for communities if they want to pass these bylaws. Right now, most zoning bylaws have to be passed by 2/3 majority. And there's a list now of, a limited set of pro-housing, pro-smart growth bylaws that have been lowered to a simple majority. And we want to add inclusionary zoning bylaws to that list. A few other items within the governor's Affordable Homes Act. We are, Kassie talked about setting, housing production goals. As part of this, we are kicking off a statewide housing plan process where we are going to every 5 years. The legislation would require us every 5 years to do a state housing plan. And we envision that as setting those goals, at a statewide, on a regional, on who are we building for, on what affordability level, doing that every 5 years. And the governor didn't want to wait until this legislation passed to do that. So she also issued an executive order that charges us with coming up with that plan right now. And so we're going to be kicking off that process, hopefully by the end of this year. And it's going to be a lot of stakeholder engagement, a lot of listening sessions. And so I look forward to you participating in that so we can come up with even more things that we know we need to do. Also in that vein, as part of the housing bond bill package, the Affordable Homes Act package, she issues an executive order on an unlocking housing production working group. And this is something that we're going to bring together experts from across the state on land use, on zoning, on environmental and climate issues, from municipalities, because we know there's so much more that we need to do, and looking at how we do land use and zoning in the Commonwealth. And so this is a group that is going to come together to really talk through and what I hope is put together our next bill, a zoning reform bill, to unlock even more of those items that can be seen as barriers at the local level in communities. And so there's a lot in here in the Affordable Homes Act for that. The other piece, it's not just about the zoning at the local level, but also supporting communities at the local level and doing what they want to do when it comes to housing. And so the Affordable Homes Act also includes authorization for communities to do a local option transfer fee on certain high-end real estate transactions, to raise money at the local level to be used at the local level. So money that a community could choose to put a fee of 0.5 to 2% on a certain high-end real estate transaction, and those dollars go right back into your community and through your municipal affordable think that the Affordable Homes Act is really a balanced approach that provides both incentives, resources, but also calls on everybody to do something, whether it comes to unlocking local zoning or doing their fair share to contributing to those resources that can help build affordable housing. And so we're really excited to really build a campaign around this, and I hope that all of you will join us in that campaign, because all these things, every single one of them is absolutely achievable. By no means is it going to be an easy process. We're really going to have to work hard in the legislature and building support from across the Commonwealth to get this done. And so I look forward to working with Progressive Dems of Massachusetts, with Abundant Housing, with our municipal officials, and all of you joining us to really put that pressure on the legislature to take this up, move it forward, and get it passed by the end of the session.
Thank you. That was a masterful, quick overview, and it brings us to exactly where I wanted to take the conversation next, which is to the politics. Lots of good ideas, both at the local level and at the state level. Lots of challenges in getting them done, and we thought that today we should focus especially on the politics at the local community level, where zoning changes are enacted, where permitting and regulation play out on the ground, and talk a little bit about both the challenges and the steps that we can actually constructively take to move things forward. And Kassie, do you want to start by just talking a little bit about how you see the challenges that we have to take on here?
Sure, Peter, thank you. Where to begin? So, you know, I think that I would say the number one challenge is that, you know, we're talking about housing production, and oftentimes the idea of building more housing to address the affordability crisis or the housing crisis, it's not always an agreeable pointer. It's not always the first place that folks go when it comes to how do we address this housing crisis. They don't necessarily see the correlation with building. And there's certainly a hostility around building more homes. And that shows up in the dynamics of planning board, zoning board of appeals, city council, town meeting, and every sort of layer of local policy making and government. And so oftentimes those lines of opposition, we've talked a little bit about the history of racism and classism in terms of essentially saying the folks that are here and have been here have a right to stay and have a right to no changes in their community or not welcoming more folks. There's certainly a sense of entitlement. But there's also a sense of I would say like fiscal protectionism, right? Of this idea that inviting more folks in means we are draining already strained resources in the community. There's concerns around traffic, overcrowding. And so oftentimes the politics really speak to the fears and less about the possibilities. What are the possibilities that building more homes and having a more diverse community can bring us? What are the possibilities of economic development? And they're more around self-interest. I think Mayor Nicholson brought up a really interesting point earlier that oftentimes we're not going to diffuse the opposition or change hearts and minds by just sort of sharing facts and data, but we often need to make the case and show how building more housing benefits everyone, and how those self-interests are actually better served when we are a more open and welcoming community. And I would say, and this is kind of getting into the solution, but we really need to build counter narratives and myth bust. So the example of building more multifamily homes will lower the property values of single family homes has really been, from an empirical perspective, misproven, because the reality is that oftentimes apartments might actually pay more in taxes and have fewer school children on average. And so I think we need to tell those stories and share those perspectives while also building more pro-housing voices and out organizing the opposition, in my opinion. Because we have to be able to say that this sort of protectionism or these more NIMBY perspectives actually means that for that same person who has that belief, perhaps their children won't be able to afford a home here in the future, or perhaps they might not be able to age in place. They might not be able to stay in their community if we don't, in fact, change the built environment, or we don't, for example, build more multifamily housing. So I think a part of the solution, which I'm happy to talk a little bit more about later, and is really the central work of abundant housing, is really amplifying and building the capacity of pro-housing voices. We need more folks to show up in support of projects at the local level, because the last thing I'll say is, as ambitious and exciting as state policy is, oftentimes it still needs to pass sort of the local government process, whether that's town meeting or city council. And that is usually where the buck stops. And so we really need to build the pro-housing support. So I'll stop there. I feel like I've been going a while.
Yeah, that was really helpful. And so, Jared, I am really dying to hear a little more of the story of how you have accomplished as much change as you already have in Lynn, and what the politics of that looked like.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, we certainly have experienced all the dynamics that Kassie just described here in our community over the last couple of years, and longer than that, but that I've been involved. And we've been able to benefit from some of the tools that Eric described at the state level. But the previous administration, I was on the school committee before I came into office, and the previous administration under Mayor McGee, had recognized that the cost of housing was a major area of concern for a lot of our residents and wanted to do something about it. And he was able to tap into one of those tools that Eric described with the housing production plan as a first step to bring everybody together. So to use the framework that's offered by the housing production plan to create a broader strategy to tackle the cost of housing. So that was started by the Lynn Housing Authority and the previous mayoral administration, and I actually served on the steering committee for that plan when I was on the school committee. A ton of work went into that, partnering with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, engaging with all the stakeholders, having lots of hard conversations, getting lots of input, and putting forward, I think, which was a bold strategy that we've continued to use. And a headline recommendation of that was the inclusionary zoning that we passed last year, and we were able to build on a lot of that work. The plan itself got a lot of political pushback with all the dynamics that Kassie described, particularly in the city of Lynn, and probably similar in other communities, this idea that, well, we already do our fair share. We already have enough affordable housing. Why aren't you doing this in other towns? And they should. The other towns should. And, I know that many of them are. But we also want to be helping our residents now that are struggling with the cost of housing, that are being displaced. So it's not enough to just wait for somebody else to step in. We need to help our residents now. And when we were talking to folks, you realize that most people, a lot of people are directly affected, but most people, even if they're not directly affected in their current situation, they know people that are close to them that are their kids or their grandparents or their neighbors or their colleagues who are getting priced out, at risk of getting priced out, can't get into the housing market, that people that want to buy that first home, and don't have a path to do so based on what their employment trajectory is. So we were able to sort of engage and bring all those folks in, and also really try to take on the biggest objections around why we shouldn't grow. We heard a lot about the schools, and I was on the school committee and continue to be the chair, and our schools are overcrowded. We're up 20% in the last 15 years. We have class sizes at unacceptably high levels and buildings that are crumbling. And we are, I think, helping lead the charge to reform the school construction process. We need to build more schools. We need additional classrooms. Blocking solutions to address affordable housing is not going to create classrooms for our students. And not helping our students and families be able to afford to stay here is going to disrupt their learning. And connecting how the housing situation cuts across these other issues, and we are really helping our students thrive by creating affordable housing opportunities. Similarly, around economic development, we all want to grow. If our companies can't find employees to hire that are able to live in the community, and it's a barrier to economic development, and it dampens our economic development aspirations. And so this issue cuts across so many different goals that we have for our community. It was a major issue. It was probably the policy issue in my race for mayor, and one that I embraced. And we did really well. We won every precinct in the city, and we were very frank about what the goal was. And so we had a lot of momentum, I think, to be able to get right to implementing it. Didn't mean that we had unanimous consensus that this was the right approach, but a lot of momentum nonetheless. And so we went through that process last year to really engage on those same issues again with similar thought and responses. And I think, we really tried to thread the needle, and I think we were able to do so. The risk is that you get the Senate NIMBY folks that Kassie described, who want to team up with some of the conservative leaning folks that don't want any affordable housing, that think this idea that we're even worried about the cost of housing is off base. And there's a risk in a community like ours that we're and others as well, that you also have folks that wish we could do more, particularly on a thing like inclusionary zoning, where it's a tool for the private market, and so you have to be mindful of what the market can bear. And there's a risk that all those folks are enough to just block any kind of action. And I think we were able to thread the needle. We were able to get the inclusionary zoning ordinance that we had passed 9-2. So again, not unanimous, but it didn't need to be in our case. And I think continue to try to drive that agenda forward.
Great. So Eric, I know your focus right now is on the politics at the state level, but I wonder if, especially based on your years at Chapman, do you have any thoughts to add about what plays out at the local level and how people can be more effective there?
I mean, after following Kassie and then hearing the mayor's comments, no, those are really the strategies that need to be engaged. It's the myth busting, it's the engagement, it's the showing up. That just there's all of that needs to be done. And the question that we ask ourselves here is, what can the state do? What can the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities do to assist, to help, to support those efforts at the local level? A group of committee provide data and information. Those are things that we're looking at right now. The lieutenant governor's talked about doing myth busting. So I think those are roles that we really have the opportunity to build on. And I'm excited about the state housing plan, because I think that's a great place to start and to build from there. So those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about right now. We'll also certainly be doing it as we take the Affordable Homes Act, the housing bond bill, on the road. We want to visit a lot of communities because there's something in this for every resident, and we want folks to know that, and because we want them speaking up to their legislators, because the work that's done at the ground level also is incredibly helpful to the the work that's done within the State House here in Boston on Beacon Hill, because it's the first place that that legislators look to when they say, oh, I'm going to look into how do I feel about ADUs? Let me go ask my local communities. And so we need those local communities lined up to say, no, this is a good idea, or we do support this. Same with the transfer fees. That makes our job here working in the State House just so much easier. So it really goes hand in hand.
Right. And Kassie, I'm mindful the time is running short, but you had a chance to talk about the challenges, and you said you had more to say about the ways to meet those challenges. I'd love to hear at least a little bit of that.
Sure. I would say, from the approach of everyday residents, folks that are on this call, I really think just going and supporting a housing project or development that's happening in your community is really important, whether you show up and testify or just write in support. I think what Mayor Nicholson mentioned around, every project sometimes isn't perfect, or perhaps maybe doesn't meet our sort of dream of deeper affordability, for example. I think sometimes the reality of the economics of housing, for better or worse, is we sometimes have to take a little bit more of an incrementalist approach, and every single unit of housing that we can get is deeply needed. And so I think really just showing up and supporting projects is probably the most important and effective use of time. But from a local government perspective, the work that we do, is really around how can we build a more inclusive base, getting more pro-housing voices to consistently be there and engage. I think sometimes local governments make an assumption about, for example, communities of color, that there's really an apathy and they just don't show up because they don't care. That's certainly far from the truth. I think we can make really keeping equity and inclusion principles in mind with our community engagement, meeting folks where they are, offering language access, offering ways to engage and give feedback that aren't even necessarily based on expecting people to show up and speak in public comment, or that are language based. Those are strategies that we've used that we've seen to be successful in building pro-housing support in places where there isn't. We've done that in places like Franklin and Norwood, and we'll continue to do it. But that's what I'll add. I know we're running short on time.
This is really helpful in just pointing us all to work that we all can do and need to do locally. I see Dick Howe's question in the chat, and I'm hoping that somebody can come up with a succinct document that addresses his questions. If not, it's something some of us should work on. I do want to note, and this is partly just a lead into our next forum, that this is a multi-dimensional problem. And there's studies, Urban Institute did a fascinating study that showed that even fixing zoning ordinances and opening up room for more housing does not itself make a dramatic difference. It's one piece of the puzzle. The financing is another huge piece. And protections of tenancies are another huge piece. There's a lot to be done. It all intersects. It doesn't mean we should neglect doing any one of these pieces, but it does mean we have to keep in mind just how many pieces there are. So as I've said, we're going to pick up in about a month with a discussion that's going to focus more on the economic aspects and try and provide some thought about where the key pieces there should be. But in the meanwhile, the message that we all need to be active and outspoken in our own communities about the importance of addressing these needs and opening up opportunities are a critical piece of the work that I hope many of us are going to have been doing and will continue to do. I want to thank Eric, Jared, Kassie, all of you, not only for joining us today, but for the incredibly important work that each of you is doing and the difference that you're each making. I hope that we can help out and do our share. So thank you all for joining us today and hope to see you at our future discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.